The morning had started out like any other ride for Tom. He loved biking alone through the dense forests that blanketed the mountains near his small town. The early morning fog rolled in thick, almost suffocating in its stillness, but he liked that. It meant fewer people out there and more solitude for him. Today, though, he noticed something was different. The forest was unusually silent. Usually, he could hear the chirping of birds or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. But now the only sound was the crunching of gravel under his tires and his own breathing. He pushed on, thinking maybe the animals were simply hiding, but an uneasy feeling lingered. As Tom climbed a steep hill, he caught a glimpse of something odd in the distance, a faint figure crossing the trail far ahead. He slowed, squinting through the fog. It looked like a person, but something about the way they moved was off. They seemed to be dragging one leg, hunched over as if carrying a weight they couldn't drop. Tom shook his head, laughing at himself for feeling spooked so easily. But he kept the stranger in the back of his mind as he continued. Further along, he found himself on a section of trail that wove around a series of deep, shadowed ravines. The trees were gnarled here, their branches reaching over the path like skeletal fingers, blotting out what little sunlight had broken through the fog. Tom felt a chill snake down his spine as he glanced at his surroundings. The ravines were dark, almost pitch black, and he couldn't shake the sensation that something in there was watching him. He sped up, pedaling faster, eager to leave the area behind, but then, snap! He slammed his brakes, heart pounding. A branch broke somewhere close by, sounding like a gunshot in the silence. Tom looked around frantically, but saw nothing. Then he heard another sound, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the gravel, moving toward him. He strained his eyes, peering into the fog, but no one appeared. Just when he thought it might have been an animal, a voice whispered his name. It was so close, he felt the breath on his neck. Tom whipped around, expecting to see someone right behind him, but there was no one. He felt the hairs on his arms stand up. "Hello?" He called out, his voice breaking the silence. No response. Only the fog, thick and impenetrable, clung around him. The trail took him deeper into the woods, and soon he realized he didn't quite recognize where he was. The scenery seemed to have changed somehow. He was sure he had taken this trail countless times, but the path seemed unfamiliar. The trees seemed closer, as if they had moved in around him, closing him off from any escape. And worst of all, the fog had grown so thick that he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Then he heard the voice again. Tom. It was unmistakable this time, low and slow, drawing out his name like it was savoring the syllables. Panic welled up inside him. He shouted into the fog, demanding whoever was out there to stop playing games, but his voice was swallowed up, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. He pushed himself to go faster, but the trail grew rougher, forcing him to slow down. Roots seemed to jut out of the ground, snagging at his tires, and the shadows between the trees grew darker, thicker. He felt the weight of unseen eyes on him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath his front tire, and he went tumbling over the handlebars, landing hard on his side. Dazed and bruised, he scrambled to his feet, reaching for his bike. But it was then that he noticed it. A pale, skeletal hand gripping the handlebar. The hand belonged to a figure crouched beside his bike, its body hidden in the fog, save for a face so gaunt and hollow it barely seemed human. Its eyes were sunken, but gleamed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was twisted into a smile that dripped malice. Tom stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure tilted its head, watching him with an almost childlike curiosity. Then it opened its mouth, wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to, and from deep within its throat, Tom heard his own voice calling out in a terrified scream. The figure was mimicking him, echoing the fear he had yet to unleash. It was mocking him, and that realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He turned and ran, abandoning his bike, his only thought to get as far away from the thing as possible. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't escape the echoing footsteps that followed him, matching his pace. Every few steps he heard that chilling whisper, repeating his name over and over, taunting him, calling him back. The fog grew denser, wrapping around him like a shroud, making it nearly impossible to see. He stumbled, his legs growing weak, his lungs burning. He pushed on, the footsteps growing louder, faster, closing in. Desperation filled him as he realized he had no idea where he was going, no way to navigate through the suffocating fog. Just as he thought he was about to collapse, he burst through the edge of the trees. The fog lifted suddenly, and he found himself standing on the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley. He could see the lights of his town far below, distant but offering a small glimmer of hope. Relief flooded him, but then he heard it, right behind him. Tom. He didn't turn. He couldn't. His body was frozen in fear. The thing was right behind him. He could feel its icy breath on his neck, hear the soft scrape of its skeletal fingers reaching out for him. A sudden, overwhelming urge to jump took hold of him, an irrational instinct to throw himself off the cliff rather than let whatever horror lurked behind him take him. He took a step forward, his feet edging toward the drop, and just as he was about to leap, he felt a sharp pain in his ankle. Something had grabbed him, pulling him back. He twisted, trying to fight it off, but there was nothing there. He was alone on the edge of the cliff, the fog dissipating around him as dawn broke over the mountains. He staggered back, falling to the ground, panting and shaking. The forest was quiet again, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. When he finally mustered the strength to stand, he looked back at the forest. The trail was empty. His bike was nowhere to be seen, and the fog had lifted completely, revealing nothing but the calm, serene woods he thought he knew so well. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching him from the shadows, hidden just beyond the trees, waiting. He turned and walked back toward town, refusing to look back again, knowing deep down that whatever he had encountered that day wasn't done with him. It was supposed to be an epic ride. They'd been planning it for weeks, 4 friends, all seasoned bikers, looking forward to a weekend of trails and mountain views. The remote trail was rumored to be haunted, but that only added to the thrill. Local legends warned of a cursed biker who vanished there years ago with only his bike found, sprawled on the trail as if he'd been ripped right off it. But the guys scoffed. They weren't superstitious, just looking for some good stories and an adrenaline rush. The first few miles were a breeze, laughter echoing through the forest as they tore down narrow paths, kicking up dirt and dodging branches. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the forest created a lively backdrop. But as they reached the denser part of the woods, the atmosphere shifted. Shadows crept in between the trees, and a heavy silence fell. Even the birds seemed to have fallen quiet. They noticed it first with Jesse's bike. His chain snapped with an unsettling crack, and he tumbled to the ground, his knee scraping against the rocks. He cursed, brushing off the blood, but it didn't bother him. They stopped, laughing at his bad luck, and watched as he fumbled with the chain, struggling to fix it. But the laughter faded when they heard the whispering. It was faint at first, almost like wind rustling through the leaves, but too deliberate. The whispers carried words, though none of them could make out what they were saying. The sound seemed to drift from all around them, circling in just out of reach. "Hey, anyone else hearing that?" Jesse's voice was low, uneasy. The others nodded, looking around, trying to pinpoint the source. But the forest was still, no sign of anyone else on the trail. They chalked it up to nerves, to tiredness, to the thrill of the ghost story they'd been joking about, and kept moving. Then it was Max. His tire blew out suddenly with a loud pop that echoed through the silence. He stumbled off the bike, swearing. "What's going on?" he muttered, looking over his shoulder. "This trail isn't that rough." Still, they all brushed it off. Max fixed his tire, but the whispering grew louder, as though it was inching closer, the words less garbled now. "You shouldn't be here." The voices seemed to hiss, cold and disapproving. Then, as they were setting off again, Eli slammed on his brakes and held up his hand, his face pale. "Guys," he whispered, pointing down the path. They followed his gaze. A figure was standing in the trail far ahead. It was barely visible in the shadows, but it looked like a man, standing impossibly still. Something was wrong, though. The figure seemed to be swaying gently, just slightly out of sync with the movement of the trees. And then, as they squinted, it seemed to disappear into the shadows entirely. "Let's just go back," Eli said, his voice shaking. The others agreed, nerves prickling their skin. They turned back the way they'd come, picking up speed, the need to leave this place overwhelming them. But the trail wasn't the same. Somehow it had changed. The twists and turns they'd come up on so easily were now unfamiliar, leading them deeper into the trees rather than toward the trailhead. Panic set in as they realized they were lost, trapped in a forest that seemed to shift and stretch around them. They biked faster, pushing hard, adrenaline driving them forward. That's when the whispering grew into laughter. Low, guttural laughter that seemed to come from every direction. The trees grew denser, the trail narrower, until they were forced to slow down. Jesse, at the back, swore he saw a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye, and when he turned, his heart nearly stopped. It was the figure again, B, moving toward him this time. It was closer, and its face, or what he thought was its face, was hollow, a yawning black void where eyes should be. He screamed, but when he turned to shout for his friends, they were gone. Only empty forest stretched in every direction. Panicked, he took off running with his bike, abandoning any thought of following a path, just wanting to get as far away as possible. But the forest grew darker and darker, and the laughter followed him, echoing between the trees. He could hear footsteps, not his own, crunching the leaves behind him. His bike began to feel heavier, as though something was dragging it down, trying to pull him back. He looked down and felt his blood freeze. A bony hand was wrapped around the handlebars, fingers impossibly long, gripping his bike with a strength he couldn't fight. And that whisper, close to his ear now, almost affectionate, "You shouldn't be here." The others, still biking furiously ahead, noticed Jesse's absence. They stopped, calling his name, but only silence answered. The laughter had faded, replaced by a new sound, the crunch of something moving slowly, deliberately through the underbrush. They all turned, each catching glimpses of shadowed figures lurking between the trees, all staring back at them with hollow, empty eyes. One by one, they began to realize that each figure had something familiar. A jacket here, a helmet there, a torn bike shoe. The realization sank into them all at once. These figures looked like riders, former bikers who had come down this trail and never left. The shadows were getting closer, drifting through the fog, empty eyes watching them with something like hunger. They were outnumbered, surrounded, trapped. Max made a break for it, sprinting forward, calling for the others to follow. But as he ran, he stumbled upon a bike lying across the path. It was Jesse's. The bike was abandoned, no sign of his friend, but a fresh set of muddy footprints trailed off into the woods, leading toward the figures. With a sickening dread, they realized what they had to do. Leaving their bikes behind, they ran as fast as they could, navigating by sheer luck, ignoring the branches clawing at their faces, ignoring the whispers calling their names. The laughter followed them the entire way, the figures close on their heels, breathing down their necks, growing louder with every step. Finally, as dawn broke through the trees, they stumbled onto the trailhead, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. They turned back, expecting the figures to follow, but the forest was still empty once again. Jesse was nowhere to be found. They tried to report it, but no one believed them, and search parties never found any trace of him. To this day, locals warn bikers to stay clear of that trail. Some say the whispers never left, drifting through the trees, calling out the names of those who dare to enter. And on misty mornings, people swear they see a lone rider, biking through the fog, his face hidden, dragging his leg as though something still clings to him, keeping him bound to that haunted forest forever. They had all heard the story before, of course. A biker named Mark who vanished one night on the old Ridgeway Trail. Locals said he was never found, and his ghost still roamed the trail, waiting for anyone foolish enough to ride it at night. But the three friends, Liam, Jake, and Sarah, didn't believe in ghost stories, so when Sarah dared them to tackle Ridgeway after sundown, they eagerly agreed. They set off around midnight. The trail was long, narrow, winding through miles of dense forest before ending at a viewpoint overlooking the valley. By day, Ridgeway was beautiful. By night, it was a different beast entirely. The forest was pitch black, and their bike lights seemed to barely pierce the shadows. Every rustling leaf and snap of a twig seemed magnified, echoing in the still, dark woods. They rode in silence for the first few miles, their tires crunching on gravel the only sound. Occasionally, one of them would glance back, feeling an odd sense of being watched, but they brushed it off as nerves. Then, about halfway along the trail, Liam's light started flickering. He smacked it a few times, but it didn't help. It cut out completely, leaving him biking in near darkness. Jake and Sarah stopped to help, but no matter what they tried, the light wouldn't turn back on. "Just stick close," Sarah said, her voice sounding louder in the quiet. "We're almost halfway." Liam reluctantly agreed, riding close behind them using their lights to guide his way. They pushed on, the woods growing denser, the air colder. Then Jake heard it, a soft, steady crunch of footsteps somewhere behind them. He slowed, glancing over his shoulder, but all he could see was darkness. Did you hear that?" he whispered. "What?" Sarah asked, stopping her bike. Liam pulled up beside them, looking nervous. "Footsteps," Jake replied, keeping his voice low. "Behind us." They all listened, but there was only silence. After a tense moment, Sarah laughed nervously. "Come on, Jake, you're just freaking yourself out." But as they started riding again, the footsteps started up, louder this time, matching their pace. It sounded like someone was walking slowly behind them, dragging their feet along the gravel. The three of them shared a panicked look, and without a word, they picked up their speed, pedaling faster. The footsteps quickened too, keeping up with them, growing louder, heavier. Liam risked a glance over his shoulder and his stomach dropped. There was a figure behind them, a tall, shadowy silhouette, just barely visible in the gloom. It was too far away to make out details, but it was moving toward them, impossibly fast. "Go!" he shouted, and they all took off, pedaling as fast as they could. They didn't dare look back again, focused only on escaping the thing that was chasing them. But no matter how fast they went, the footsteps kept pace, growing louder as if it was gaining on them. Then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, Sarah's bike suddenly lurched to a stop, as though it had hit an invisible wall. She was thrown from her bike, landing hard on the gravel. The others stopped, helping her up, but when they looked down at her bike, they saw it. The chain had been snapped clean in two, as if by some unseen force. "Sarah, are you okay?" Liam asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, wincing, but before she could respond, a soft voice floated through the darkness, chilling them to the bone. "Why are you here?" it asked, echoing through the trees. They all froze, staring into the darkness, hearts pounding. The voice was close, too close. They shone their lights around, searching for the source, but the forest was empty. The shadows seemed to press in around them, and that awful feeling of being watched intensified. "Let's go," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. "We'll walk if we have to, but we have to get out of here." They picked up their bikes, Sarah limping as she walked alongside hers. The footsteps returned, following them closer than ever, as if whoever or whatever was behind them was right on their heels. And then they heard it, the rattling of chains, scraping along the gravel, accompanied by the slow, dragging footsteps. It was an unnatural sound, chilling and relentless, like the tolling of a death knell. They broke into a run, half stumbling down the trail, the footsteps and chains closing in on them. Sarah looked back just once and regretted it instantly. She saw the figure in full, a gaunt, skeletal form, its face hidden in shadow, dragging a rusted chain behind it. Its eyes were hollow, glowing faintly in the darkness, fixed intently on her. Her scream seemed to shatter the silence, echoing through the woods, but it didn't stop the figure. It moved faster, its movements unnatural and jerky, as though its limbs were being pulled by invisible strings. They ran, adrenaline propelling them forward, until they finally burst out of the trees and onto the main road. They didn't stop, sprinting down the road until they reached the safety of their cars. Only then did they dare look back, but the figure was gone. The woods were quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Shaken, they piled into their cars, not speaking until they were miles away from Ridgeway. Only then did Jake break the silence. That was real, right?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. None of them answered. They didn't want to acknowledge what they'd seen, what had chased them down the trail, but they all knew, deep down, that the stories had been true. From that night on, Ridgeway was no longer a place they dared to visit, and on quiet nights, when the wind was still, they swore they could still hear the faint rattle of chains echoing through their dreams, calling them back to the darkness they'd narrowly escaped. It was the middle of summer, and Mason, Annie, and Rob decided to try out the Whispering Pines Loop. They'd heard stories of the trail, but brushed them off as campfire tales, exaggerated by locals. It was supposed to be beautiful, weaving through pine forests and dense groves, and it was secluded enough that they'd have the whole trail to themselves. They set out just before dusk, planning to ride the whole loop before dark. The trail was calm at first, winding through clusters of towering pines. The setting sun cast long shadows, turning the trees into dark pillars that stretched endlessly into the canopy. Everything seemed fine until Annie stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Mason and Rob slowed, listening, but there was only silence. Mason laughed it off, saying she was just spooked by the woods. They kept riding, but Annie kept glancing over her shoulder, feeling as if something was following them. A few miles in, Rob's bike suddenly screeched to a halt. He stumbled off, inspecting his back tire. It was twisted beyond repair, like it had been kicked out of place. There hadn't been a rock or a root to cause it, and they were all puzzled. But they were far into the trail now, so Rob had no choice but to walk his bike, trailing behind the others. The sun was dipping lower, casting the forest in an eerie half-light, shadows pooling between the trees. That's when they heard it, a faint sound, like murmuring voices, far off in the woods. It was so quiet they almost missed it, but as they continued, the whispers grew louder, an odd, disembodied muttering that seemed to follow them along the trail. "Maybe it's the wind," Mason said, trying to reassure the others, but he didn't sound convinced. Then Annie's light started flickering. She tapped it, muttering under her breath, but it kept going out. She pulled to a stop, trying to fix it, when she felt something cold brush her arm. She whipped around, expecting to see a branch or a leaf, but there was nothing there, only the shadowed trees looming closer than she remembered. "Mason, Rob, something's not right. I don't think we're alone out here." Her voice was barely a whisper, and Rob nodded, glancing back down the trail, his face pale. "I've felt it too," he admitted, his voice wavering, like something's watching us. They continued, nerves taut, and soon the murmuring grew louder. It wasn't just random sounds anymore. It was laughter, soft, chilling, echoing around them, rising and falling with the wind. Annie's heart pounded as they rode on, but every now and then she'd catch movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to be anything natural. The laughter was joined by the sound of footsteps pacing just off the trail, as if something was keeping pace with them, hidden by the shadows. Rob tried to lighten the mood, forcing a laugh. "All right, who's playing tricks on us? You got your friends hiding out here or something, Mason?" But Mason just shook his head, his face pale. "No, I swear, it's just us." A heavy silence settled between them. Then they heard a new sound, a bike bell, faint and tinny, like it was coming from deep in the forest. It rang once, then twice, echoing through the trees in a slow, steady rhythm. They stopped dead, looking at each other, fear twisting in their guts. No one else was supposed to be out here tonight. They hadn't seen a single soul since they started. "That doesn't make any sense," Annie whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe we should head back," Rob said, his voice barely a whisper. But when they looked back down the trail, it didn't look right. The path seemed darker somehow, twisting off into the trees in ways they didn't remember. Desperation took hold, and they decided to press forward, hoping the loop would take them back to the trailhead soon. They started riding faster, the laughter following them, the bike bell chiming occasionally in the distance. But no matter how fast they went, they couldn't shake the sense of being followed. Then Mason's tire hit something, and he went sprawling. He looked up to see a figure standing just off the trail, half hidden in shadow. The figure wore an old-fashioned bike helmet, tilted at an odd angle, and its head was slightly cocked, as though observing them with a quiet, unsettling curiosity. Its eyes were hollow, empty, a void that seemed to suck in the light around it. "Mason, get up!" Annie shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. The figure didn't move, just watched, but as they backed away, its mouth slowly curled into a wide, unnatural smile. They stumbled back onto the trail, hearts racing, and took off. They rode hard, but the shadows around them seemed to lengthen, growing deeper, darker. The trail twisted in ways they couldn't predict, as though the forest itself was trying to keep them there. Finally, the laughter and footsteps faded, leaving them in silence. They thought they were safe, but that's when the fog rolled in, thick and sudden, swallowing the trail and reducing their visibility to almost nothing. They stopped, fear gripping them. I don't know where we are anymore," Mason whispered. The trail seemed different, less like the path they'd come down and more like some twisted mirror of it, where the trees loomed too close, their branches arching like skeletal arms. Just then, the bike bell chimed again, closer now, echoing from somewhere deep in the fog, and with it came the sound of chains rattling, dragging through the dirt. A shadow moved through the fog, a figure approaching, slowly, deliberately, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Annie screamed, and they ran, abandoning their bikes, stumbling blindly through the fog. The figure followed, its footsteps slow and steady, the bike bell chiming in a mocking rhythm. No matter how fast they went, the sound never faded. They ran until their legs gave out, collapsing in exhaustion. When they finally looked up, they were back at the trailhead, the fog lifting as dawn broke over the trees. Their bikes were nowhere to be seen, as if they'd been swallowed up by the forest. And as they staggered back to their car, they heard one final chime of the bike bell, faint but clear, echoing from deep within the trees. To this day, none of them can remember how they found their way back. They tell people to stay off Whispering Pines at night, but they know that some won't listen. And every so on foggy mornings, hikers report hearing a faint bike bell ringing through the trees, accompanied by the eerie, hollow laughter of something that never truly left the forest. The group of 5 had been planning this night ride for weeks. The creeping hollow trail was notorious among local bikers. Long and winding, it was known for its steep descents, sharp turns, and dense fog that seemed to gather there, even on clear nights. But the real reason people avoided it was the legend of the Ghost Rider. They said that years ago, a biker named Ethan had disappeared there, only for his bike to turn up months later, rusted and mangled, and off with no trace of him ever found. But the group didn't believe in ghost stories. They'd all heard the tale before and were more interested in the thrill of the ride than any superstitious warning. So, with their flashlights strapped on and hearts racing, they set out just after midnight, the forest looming ahead. The first few miles were uneventful. They joked and laughed, occasionally glancing back to make sure the whole group was sticking together. The trail was just as difficult as they'd heard, but the challenge only added to the excitement. The cool night air carried the scent of pine and earth, and the only sound was the crunch of their tires on the gravel. But then the fog began to roll in, thick and sudden, as though it had been waiting for them. It clung to the ground, swirling around their wheels and casting everything in a ghostly white haze. They slowed down, the path growing harder to see, the trees closing in around them like dark sentinels. That's when Emily's bike light started to flicker. She muttered to herself, tapping the light to steady it, but it continued to dim. Before long, it went out entirely, leaving her in near darkness. "Wait up, guys!" she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the fog. The others stopped, turning back to find her. They gathered around, trying to fix the light, but no matter what they did, it wouldn't turn on. "Let's just stick close together," her friend Chris suggested, glancing nervously into the fog. "We're almost halfway through." They continued on, Emily riding close to the others, but the sense of unease was growing. The fog seemed to get denser, absorbing their lights, and a strange silence fell over the trail. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then they heard it, a faint sound just on the edge of hearing. It was a soft, steady hum, like a wheel turning slowly, creaking as if it hadn't moved in years. They all stopped, straining to listen. "Did you hear that?" whispered Mark, his voice barely audible. No one answered. They were all listening, hearts pounding as the sound grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now, the sound of a bike moving slowly through the fog, circling them. "Who else would be out here?" Emily asked, trying to laugh it off, but there was a tremor in her voice. "Let's keep moving," Chris said, his voice tense. "It's probably just another rider messing with us." They picked up the pace, trying to ignore the sound that seemed to follow them, always just out of sight. But no matter how fast they went, the creaking bike stayed with them, as though it was gliding through the fog, watching them. Suddenly, Kevin, who was at the front of the group, swerved hard, nearly losing his balance. His friends stopped, calling out to him, but he didn't respond. He was staring into the trees, his face pale. "Kevin, what is it?" Emily asked, pulling up beside him. He pointed, his hand trembling. Through the fog, they could just make out a figure standing between the trees. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a torn biking jacket. His head was down, and his face was obscured by shadows, but his posture was rigid, unnatural. And in his hand, he held a rusted bike chain, dangling from his grip, swaying gently as though it had just been used. What is that?" Chris whispered, but no one had an answer. They could only stare, rooted to the spot as the figure slowly raised its head. Its face was hollow, eyes empty and dark like twin voids staring straight at them. And then, with an unnatural jerky movement, it lifted one hand and pointed down the trail as if inviting them to follow. They didn't wait. Heartbeats thundering, they took off down the trail, pedaling faster than they'd ever gone before. The fog closed in around them, making it nearly impossible to see, but they didn't dare slow down. They could hear the creak of the bike, the rattle of chains, and the occasional low, eerie hum, growing louder, closer, as if the figure was right behind them. Then, as they rounded a bend, the ground seemed to shift beneath them. Chris's bike skidded, and he crashed hard, landing in a patch of mud. He groaned, trying to get up, but his friends were already pulling him to his feet, urging him to keep moving. But when they looked around, they realized the trail was gone. They were standing in a clearing they didn't recognize, surrounded by dense trees and fog that seemed to stretch forever. The trail had simply vanished, and there was no sign of which way they'd come. Panic set in as they realized they were completely lost. They called out, their voices echoing in the silence, but there was no response, only the eerie, creaking sound that hadn't left them. Then the laughter started. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, echoing around them from all directions. It was a cold, mocking sound, filling the air with an unnatural chill. And as they turned, they saw him again, the Ghost Rider, standing at the edge of the clearing, watching them with those empty, hollow eyes. He lifted his rusted bike chain, letting it drag across the ground, scraping like nails on a chalkboard. And then, with slow, deliberate steps, he began to move toward them. "Run!" someone shouted, and they took off blindly through the trees, abandoning their bikes, crashing through the underbrush. The laughter followed them, mingling with the creak of the bike and the rattle of the chain, haunting their every step. They ran until their lungs burned, until their legs gave out, until they could no longer hear the laughter or the creaking. And when they finally dared to stop and look around, they found themselves back on the main road, miles from the trailhead, with no memory of how they'd escaped. They never spoke of what they'd seen, but each of them knew they'd never return to Creeping Hollow. And every so often, late at night, they would hear the faint sound of a creaking bike and the low, cold laughter of the Ghost Rider, still haunting the trail, waiting for his next riders to join him. The evening was clear, the perfect night for a group ride along Timber Ridge, a trail known for its sharp cliffs and breathtaking views of the valley below. Andy, Jess, Carlos, and Zoe were experienced bikers, confident enough to ignore the warnings about this particular trail. There were rumors, of course. Locals said that Timber Ridge wasn't just dangerous because of its steep drops, but because strange things had happened there. Bikers claimed to hear strange whispers, to feel something cold following them on the trail. But these were just stories. At least that's what they told themselves. As they set out, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the valley. The trail twisted and turned, the trees casting long shadows that stretched across their path. The air grew cooler, and an odd, faint smell of smoke drifted on the breeze. Zoe noticed it first, wrinkling her nose. "Anyone else smell that?" she asked, glancing around. Carlos nodded, squinting into the trees. Probably just a campfire somewhere nearby. They kept riding, their lights cutting through the gathering darkness. But as they rounded a bend, they were hit with a strong gust of wind, carrying the smell of burning wood, more intense this time. And then, faintly, they heard it, a sound like distant crackling, as if something were burning just out of sight. "Did they allow fires on the trail?" Andy asked, but no one had an answer. They pressed on, feeling a chill creep down their spines despite the warm summer air. It was silent, aside from the crunch of gravel beneath their wheels. But as they reached a narrow stretch of the trail, Jess heard something. A faint, hushed voice, barely audible over the wind. "Did you hear that?" she asked, stopping her bike and turning to look at the others. They all shook their heads. "Probably just the wind," Carlos said, though he looked uneasy. But Jess was certain she'd heard something, a whisper too low to make out but unmistakably human. They continued, riding faster, eager to reach the end of the trail and put the strange feeling behind them. But the whispers grew louder, echoing in the trees around like dozens of voices murmuring just out of sight. The others began to hear it too, and they exchanged nervous glances. Then, as they rounded a sharp corner, they saw it. A figure standing on the edge of the trail, cloaked in shadows. It was a woman, her hair tangled and wild, her face hidden by the darkness. She seemed to be watching them, standing perfectly still. They all skidded to a stop, staring at the figure, unsure of what to do. Jess was the first to call out, her voice shaky. "Hello? Are you okay?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond. And then, without warning, she took a slow, shuddering step toward them. In the dim light of their flashlights, they could see her face, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through them. "Let's go," Andy muttered, his voice trembling. "Now." They took off, pedaling hard, but as they looked back, the woman was gone. The trail was empty, as though she'd never been there at all. But the whispers continued, growing louder, more urgent, as if the very trees were speaking to them. As they raced down the trail, Carlos swerved, his bike almost tipping over. He'd caught sight of something, a flicker of movement in the trees. There, just behind them, he saw the woman again, gliding along the edge of the trail, her eyes fixed on him, her mouth moving as if she were whispering words he couldn't understand. Panic took over, and they rode faster, the trail twisting sharply, the cliffs on either side seeming to close in on them. But no matter how fast they went, they couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. They could feel her presence, close behind, moving in unnatural silence, her hollow eyes watching their every move. Then, as they approached a particularly steep section of the trail, the smell of smoke intensified, filling their lungs, making their eyes water. They skidded to a stop, coughing, looking around in confusion. "That smell? Where's it coming from?" Zoe choked out, her eyes darting around. And then they saw it. Just ahead, the ground was scorched black, as if a fire had raged there, though there were no flames, no embers, only a blackened patch of earth and the faint, acrid smell of smoke. As they stared, the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic chorus, filling the air with unintelligible words. Suddenly, Zoe gasped, pointing at the ground. In the scorched earth, they could see footprints, small, bare, leading away from the trail and disappearing into the trees. But there was something wrong about them. The prints were too close together, twisted at odd angles, as if whoever had left them hadn't walked, but had been dragged. "Let's keep going. We need to get out of here," Carlos urged, his voice shaking. But before they could move, they heard a soft, faint laugh echoing through the trees. It was a high, eerie sound, like a child's laughter, chilling and out of place in the dark forest. They took off, pedaling hard, the laughter following them, growing louder, more manic, filling their ears until it was all they could hear. They didn't dare look back, too afraid of what they might see. But as they neared the end of the trail, Andy's bike suddenly hit something, throwing him off balance. He stumbled, falling hard, his flashlight rolling away. As he scrambled to get up, he froze, staring at the ground in horror. There, in the dirt, were more footprints, leading in a perfect circle around where he'd fallen. And standing at the edge of the circle, watching him, was the woman, her face twisted into a haunting smile, her eyes glinting with a strange, hungry light. He screamed, scrambling to his feet, and the others grabbed him, pulling him along, not stopping until they burst out of the trees and onto the road. Only then did they dare look back, but the trail was empty. The woman was gone, and the forest was silent once more. They never spoke of what happened that night, each of them haunted by memories of the woman's hollow eyes, the strange laughter, the smell of smoke, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, they could still smell it, the faint, acrid scent of burning wood, lingering in the air as a reminder of what waited for them on Timber Ridge, just beyond the edge of the light. It was a cloudy autumn afternoon when Jacob, Lena, and Sam decided to tackle the old Ridgeline Trail. Known for its steep ascents and narrow paths carved along the edge of a mountain, Ridgeline had a dark reputation. Years ago, a biker had vanished there. His name was Eric, and he was known for being the fastest downhill rider in the area. He'd pushed his luck one night, taking the trail alone. When he didn't return, search parties combed the woods but found no sign of him. Only his bike, twisted and mangled, wedged between the rocks. Since then, locals swore they'd seen lights on the trail at night and heard the screech of brakes where there were no riders. The three friends were thrill seekers and decided to ignore the rumors, setting out on the trail as dusk settled in. The chill in the air was biting, the wind rustling through the trees. They made good time, laughing and joking, the glow of their lights cutting through the creeping shadows. As they climbed, the dense trees opened to a view of the valley far below, stretching out under a rapidly darkening sky. The trail was barely wide enough for them to ride single file. Jacob was in the lead, Sam behind him, and Lena taking up the rear. They pressed on in near silence, the only sounds the crunch of gravel under their wheels and the occasional gust of wind. Then, as they approached the summit, Lena felt something, an odd sensation, like they weren't alone. She glanced back, but there was nothing, only the darkness pooling along the trail behind them. "Hey, did either of you feel that?" Lena called, her voice tight. "Feel what?" Jacob asked over his shoulder. "I don't know. Like we're being followed." Jacob laughed, dismissing it as nerves, but Sam gave her a nervous look. They continued, but now even Jacob couldn't shake the feeling. The wind seemed to grow colder, the air carrying a strange metallic scent, sharp and unnatural. It wasn't long before they heard it, the unmistakable sound of a bike following them, the soft whir of gears and the creak of a rusty chain. Jacob stopped, turning his head. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lena and Sam nodded, eyes wide. There was no one else on the trail, no lights other than their own, and yet the sound of the bike persisted, just out of sight. They started moving again, a bit faster this time, but the sound followed, always at the same distance, like it was matching their pace. They tried to brush it off, convincing themselves it was just an echo, a trick of the wind. But then Sam's light started flickering. He tapped it, muttering under his breath, but the light dimmed until he was left in near darkness. "Hold on," Lena said, stopping to help him. As they fiddled with the light, a cold breeze swept through, bringing with it a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. They all froze, listening. Did that sound like a voice to you?" Lena whispered, her voice shaking. Jacob was about to reply when they heard it again, faint but unmistakable. A man's voice, strained and hoarse, whispering, "Help me." It sent chills down their spines, and they backed up, looking around. But the trail was empty, save for the looming trees and the yawning darkness. "Let's get out of here," Jacob said, mounting his bike, his tone urgent. They took off down the trail, like their lights bobbing and weaving through the darkness. But the whispering continued, growing louder, more desperate. They could make out the words now, fragments of sentences, as if someone was struggling to speak. "Can't. Get out. Please. Wait." The voice was joined by the sound of tires skidding on gravel, brakes screeching, and a horrible metallic crunch like something heavy crashing into rocks. It was the sound of a terrible accident, one that seemed all too real. Sam glanced over his shoulder, his face pale. "I think it's Eric, the biker who disappeared." "No, it's just the wind," Jacob said, though his own voice was trembling. But they all knew it wasn't just the wind. The sound of the bike, the whispering, the crash, it was as though they were hearing Eric's last moments, trapped in a loop, playing out over and over. They rounded a corner, skidding to a stop as a dense fog rolled in from nowhere, covering the trail and making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. They could barely see each other now, their lights swallowed by the mist. The whispers turned into moans, chilling and mournful, echoing through the fog. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Lena saw it, a light, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere behind them. It was a headlamp, flickering in and out like a firefly, bobbing through the fog as it approached. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. The light continued its steady approach, no answer in return. But as it drew closer, she could make out a shape, a figure on a bike, hunched over, pedaling slowly, methodically, moving toward them. The figure was closer now, and she could see him clearly, a man wearing a tattered biking jersey, his head hanging at an unnatural angle, his arms stiff, his face hidden in shadow. She took a step back, her legs trembling, and the others followed her gaze, their faces pale with horror. The man's head lifted, revealing hollow, lifeless eyes that seemed to see right through them. His mouth moved, repeating the same words over and over in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding underfoot. "Help me. Can't. Get out." They watched, frozen in fear, as he rode closer, the fog swirling around him, carrying the faint scent of decay. When he was only a few feet away, he reached out a hand, his fingers twisted and bruised, reaching toward them as if trying to pull them into his nightmare. Jacob snapped out of his trance, grabbing Lena and Sam. "Go! Now!" They took off, pedaling as fast as they could, the fog clinging to them like ghostly tendrils. The whispers turned to wails, filling the air, drowning out the sounds of their own breathing. They could feel the figure following, always just behind them, his headlamp flickering like a specter in the mist. They rode harder, hearts pounding, lungs burning, until finally the fog began to thin, and they saw the glimmer of the trailhead up ahead. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie silence, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. They burst onto the main road, collapsing onto the ground, their hearts racing, their bodies drenched in cold sweat. When they looked back, the trail was empty, the fog dissipating as if it had never been there. The three friends never returned to Ridgeline. But sometimes, late at night, they could still hear it. The faint whir of a bike chain, the echo of a whisper in the darkness, and the desperate, haunting plea of a man who was never found. "Help me. Can't. Get out." They had always heard stories about the abandoned loop, a forgotten biking trail deep in the forest. No one really knew how it got its name, but the older riders would tell tales of strange occurrences there, and many claimed it was haunted. A few brave bikers had ventured onto the trail only to come back shaken, speaking of feeling watched, hearing distant cries, and seeing shadows dart between the trees. But curiosity got the better of Nick, Tasha, and Liam, three seasoned bikers looking for a thrill, and one chilly October evening, they decided to give the loop a go. The entrance was hard to find, hidden behind a cluster of dense trees. The dirt path was barely visible under the undergrowth and twisted vines, as if the forest had tried to reclaim it. As they ventured deeper, the canopy thickened, casting long shadows even though it was barely past dusk. The trail seemed much older than they'd expected. Roots and stones jutted out of the ground, making every twist and turn treacherous. A mile or so in, they started hearing it. A soft, distant hum, like wind whistling through a hollow space. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it seemed to follow them, picking up speed as they did. They brushed it off as the wind, but Nick couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. He was in the lead and had to keep glancing back to make sure the others were still there, finding their faces illuminated in strange, unnatural ways by their headlamps. After a while, the trail began to slope downward. The hum grew louder, and they could all hear it now, a rhythmic sound that almost seemed like breathing, slow and heavy, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. They stopped, looking around, but there was only darkness and silence. "You guys hear that?" Tasha asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah," Liam muttered, his eyes darting nervously. "It sounds like it's coming from everywhere." Nick tried to brush it off, putting on a brave face. "It's just the wind. Let's keep moving." They continued, but the breathing sound stayed with them, sometimes fading, sometimes growing louder, like something was lurking just out of sight. The deeper they went, the stranger things became. Shapes seemed to move at the edges of their lights, and shadows flickered even when there was no apparent source. Then they reached an old wooden bridge, rotted and unstable, stretched across a shallow, foggy creek. The air was thick and cold, and the temperature seemed to drop the moment they approached it. They hesitated, staring at the bridge, unsure if it was safe. But going back up the trail felt equally wrong, and they were determined to finish the loop. One by one, they crossed, the boards creaking and groaning under their weight. Just as Tasha stepped off, there was a loud snap and the bridge buckled, collapsing into the creek below. She barely made it across, and they all stood in stunned silence, staring at the spot where the bridge had once been. "Well," Tasha said, forcing a nervous laugh, "no going back now." They pressed on, but the path became narrower and steeper, with thick roots and rocks blocking the way. The forest grew darker, and their lights seemed to dim, barely cutting through the shadows. And then they noticed something strange. Scratch marks on the trees, long and deep, as if something with massive claws had raked through the bark. Some of the trees even had strange symbols carved into them, jagged, unfamiliar shapes that seemed to pulse in the dim light. What are these?" Liam asked, running his fingers over the carvings. They looked like they'd been there for decades, weathered but still sharp and clear. "Don't touch them," Nick said, his voice tight. He didn't know why, but something about those symbols filled him with dread. As they continued, the air grew thick with an acrid smell, like burnt wood mixed with rot. They tried to ignore it, but it only got stronger, making them gag. And then they saw it, a faint light ahead, flickering like a candle, casting eerie shadows across the trail. "Who would be out here?" Tasha whispered. But there was no answer. Cautiously, they approached the light, which turned out to be an old lantern hanging from a branch. The glass was cracked, the metal rusted, but it was lit, casting a pale, unnatural glow over the trail. Next to it was an old, crumpled map pinned to the tree. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age, but when Nick reached out to touch it, he felt it was cold, almost wet. The map showed the trail they were on, but with one disturbing detail. At the bottom of the loop, there was a warning scrawled in faded red ink. "Do not enter beyond this point." They looked up, realizing they were right at that part of the loop, and ahead, the trail disappeared into a dark thicket where no light could penetrate. It was like staring into a void. "We should turn back," Liam said, his voice shaking. "But the bridge is gone," Tasha replied, her voice barely a whisper. With no other choice, they continued, the oppressive darkness closing in around them. The trees seemed to lean over, twisting into unnatural shapes as if reaching out to grab them, and the breathing sound grew louder, now accompanied by low, guttural whispers. The whispers were unintelligible, but there was an urgency to them, a pleading tone that sent chills down their spines. Suddenly, Nick's bike stopped short, as though something had grabbed it. He looked down to see roots twisting around his tires, thick and pulsating, almost like veins. He yanked his bike free, and as he did, a shadow shifted ahead of them, a tall, distorted figure, standing perfectly still in the middle of the trail. They all froze, their lights illuminating the figure's gaunt face, pale and hollow-eyed, staring at them with a cold, dead gaze. The figure was wearing a torn biking jersey, its colors faded with age, and its arms hung at unnatural angles. "Eric?" Tasha whispered, horrified. The figure took a slow step toward them, raising one bony hand as if reaching out. But it didn't move naturally. It seemed to glide, almost as if it were floating just above the ground. Without thinking, they turned and fled, pedaling as fast as they could, the breathing and whispers swelling into a deafening roar. The forest seemed to close in around them, the roots and branches reaching out to grab them, twisting and curling like fingers. They rode until they could barely breathe, the trail twisting and turning, becoming a blur of shadows and flashing lights. But no matter how fast they went, they could still feel it behind them. The shadowy figure gliding through the trees, its hollow eyes fixed on them. Finally, they burst out of the thicket, emerging back at the broken bridge. In their panic, they hadn't realized they'd somehow come full circle. The creek was still below, the broken boards littering the ground, but now there was another figure there, another biker, face down, limbs twisted, his jersey torn. Is that Eric?" Liam gasped, staring at the unmoving body. But before they could look closer, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching from behind them, slow, deliberate, and getting closer. They didn't wait to find out who or what it was. Abandoning their bikes, they scrambled across the creek, slipping on the rocks, tearing through the underbrush until they finally stumbled out of the woods and onto the main road. Panting, they turned back, half expecting to see the figure following them. But the entrance to the abandoned loop was gone, swallowed by the darkness. They never found the trail again, and when they asked around, no one seemed to remember where it was. Years later, when they spoke about that night, they'd hear rumors of other riders who had gone missing there, who'd ventured into the abandoned loop and never returned. And sometimes on the coldest nights, they'd swear they could hear faint whispers on the wind, a desperate plea for help, and the slow, steady sound of footsteps approaching from the shadows. Jason, Mia, and Tom were seasoned riders, always on the lookout for a challenge. That's why, when they heard about the Ghost Run Trail, they couldn't resist. The trail was a notorious stretch through an old forest on the outskirts of town, known for its eerie beauty and, according to legend, its ghostly encounters. Locals warned that it was haunted by a spirit known as the Watcher, who was said to appear only to those brave or foolish enough to ride alone at night. Of course, they dismissed the stories as nothing more than folklore. They set out on a chilly November evening, laughing at the rumors. The trailhead was marked by an ancient, twisted oak tree, its branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, casting long shadows under the dim moonlight. The moment they crossed beneath its branches, they felt the temperature drop sharply, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. The first few miles were uneventful. They joked and talked, their voices echoing faintly through the trees. But as they ventured deeper, the trees grew closer, their branches overhead interlocking like a dense canopy, shutting out the moonlight. Only their bike lights cut through the inky darkness, casting eerie shadows on the path ahead. After a while, they noticed something strange. Their own voices had stopped echoing. Every word felt muted, swallowed by the thick forest around them. The air was thick, cold, and heavy, and an odd scent lingered, something sharp and metallic, like rust. Jason laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood, but the others remained quiet, unease creeping over them. Then, as they rounded a sharp bend, Mia felt her back tire skid slightly. She looked down, expecting to see a root or a rock, but instead there was a small pile of broken glass glinting under her light. She stopped, staring at the shards. "What kind of jerk leaves glass out here?" she muttered, but her voice sounded distant, as if muffled. They kept moving, but the forest seemed to tighten around them, branches brushing against them like grasping hands. And then they saw it, a bike lying in the middle of the path. Its frame was twisted, wheels bent, the paint chipped and worn. The bike looked ancient, like it had been left there for years. "Who would leave their bike here?" Tom said, nudging it with his own tire. Just as he did, they heard a soft, wheezing sound, a strange, ragged breath coming from somewhere close by. They whipped their lights around, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. The breathing continued, though, growing louder, heavier, like it was surrounding them. Then a voice, low and raspy, broke through the darkness. "Why? Are you here?" They froze. The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it echoed all around them, bouncing off the trees. Jason forced a laugh, though his voice shook. "Very funny, guys. Who's messing with us?" But neither Mia nor Tom was laughing. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with fear. They continued riding, picking up speed, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. But the voice persisted, growing louder, seeming to come from every direction. "You don't belong here." Suddenly, Mia felt a cold hand brush against her shoulder. She gasped, turning to see no one. Just shadows shifting in the darkness. She looked at the others, panic in her eyes. Did you guys feel that?" They shook their heads, but their expressions told her they weren't any calmer. Then they noticed something else. The forest seemed to have changed. The trail, which had been familiar and well-worn, now twisted and turned in unfamiliar ways, leading them deeper into the woods. They should have been nearing the trail's end by now, but instead they felt like they were going in circles. The breathing sound grew louder, and with it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence. Jason looked over his shoulder, his light sweeping through the trees. That's when he saw it. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, watching them from the edge of the trail. It was tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long, its face obscured by the shadows. "Run!" he shouted, and they all took off, pedaling as fast as they could, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast they went, they could still hear it behind them. The soft, relentless footsteps, keeping pace, drawing closer with every turn. Then Tom's bike suddenly stopped short, as if he'd hit an invisible wall. He was thrown forward, landing hard on the ground, the breath knocked out of him. As he looked up, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The figure was standing over him, staring down with hollow, empty eyes. Its face was pale and stretched, with a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, as if frozen in eternal agony. "Tom, get up!" Mia screamed, reaching out to pull him to his feet. They managed to get him back on his bike, and they took off again, the figure's raspy breathing filling the air around them. The trail twisted and turned, growing narrower, almost as if it was trying to trap them. The trees loomed over them, their branches reaching down like claws. Finally, they saw a faint light up ahead, the trailhead, the twisted oak tree. They were almost out. They pedaled harder, the footsteps and breathing growing louder, closer. The figure was behind them now, barely a few feet away, its cold, clammy breath brushing against their necks. They burst out of the trail, the chill of the forest replaced by the biting night air. They didn't stop until they reached the safety of the road, where they collapsed, gasping for breath. They looked back, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the forest, but there was nothing, only the dark, silent trees. For a moment, they thought they'd imagined it all. But as they caught their breath, they realized something horrifying. The bike they had seen on the trail, the ancient, rusted frame, it was lying at the base of the twisted oak tree, its wheels still slowly spinning. They never spoke of the experience again. but they couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them out of the forest. Sometimes, when they rode at night, they'd feel a cold breath on the back of their necks or catch a glimpse of a figure lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. And on the quietest nights, they could still hear it, the soft, relentless footsteps and the whispering voice, asking the same question over and over. Why are you here? They called it the Vanishing Road. It was a narrow, hidden path winding through the heart of Blackwood Forest. Bikers who knew about it spoke in hushed voices, sharing eerie tales over campfires and late-night rides. They said it was a place where things didn't work right, where time shifted, the woods whispered, and people vanished without a trace. Some riders claimed that those who entered often didn't make it back before dark, and those who did came back changed. Isaac, a thrill-seeking biker who prided himself on his fearlessness, decided to conquer the Vanishing Road. Despite his friends' warnings, he brushed off the tales as nonsense. It's just another trail, he said. Nothing but shadows and stories to spook people. One October afternoon, he packed his gear, loaded his bike, and set off alone. The sky was a dull gray, heavy with the promise of rain. He reached the trailhead by mid-afternoon, finding it empty and eerily quiet. The only sound was the rustling of leaves as the wind swept through the trees. As he pushed deeper into the forest, the trail grew rougher. The trees thickened, twisting into unnatural shapes. Moss clung to the trunks like a shroud, and low-hanging branches seemed to reach out like skeletal hands. Yet Isaac pressed on, feeling more exhilarated than afraid. But after a while, something odd caught his attention. The trail didn't seem to follow any logical path. It twisted and doubled back on itself, and the markers he'd seen earlier had vanished. Then he saw it. An old, rusted road sign half buried in the ground. Do not enter. The letters were barely legible, choked by moss and vines. He laughed to himself, snapping a photo with his phone, a souvenir of the forbidden trail. He pushed forward, ignoring the unease gnawing at him. The forest grew darker as clouds thickened overhead, and the air took on a strange chill. As he rounded a bend, his phone buzzed with an incoming notification. But when he glanced at it, the screen displayed nonsense, symbols and numbers that didn't make any sense. The time had changed, too. It showed 3:17, then flickered to 6:45, then froze. He shrugged it off, figuring it was a glitch. But then he started to notice other oddities, shadows that seemed to shift in his peripheral vision. A faint, far-off whisper that sounded like his name. He stopped listening, but all he could hear was the wind. He shook his head, dismissing it as paranoia, and kept riding. But the deeper he went, the stranger things became. The forest had fallen into an unnatural silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, only the low hum of his tires against the path. And then he saw something that made his heart stop. Another biker, standing completely still in the middle of the trail. The figure's back was turned, dressed in outdated gear, mud-caked and worn. Isaac slowed, calling out, "Hey, you all right?" The biker didn't move. Isaac approached cautiously, the hairs on his neck prickling. "Hello?" The figure turned slowly, and Isaac's stomach dropped. The face was covered by a cracked, mud-splattered helmet, but through the broken visor, Isaac saw empty, hollow eye sockets staring blankly ahead. The figure raised one hand, skeletal fingers outstretched, pointing back down the trail Isaac had come from. Without a second thought, Isaac spun his bike around and pedaled as hard as he could. He raced down the trail, heart pounding, but after a few minutes, he skidded to a halt. The trail wasn't the same. It seemed to go on forever, stretching in both directions. The trees twisted overhead, forming a tunnel that grew darker with each passing moment. Isaac glanced around, recognizing none of his surroundings. The trail markers were gone, replaced by strange symbols carved into the trees, symbols that looked like they had been scratched by clawed hands. He checked his phone, hoping for a signal or a GPS map, but the screen displayed only static, and the battery icon drained rapidly, from 60 to 40%, to dead. "Just stay calm," he told himself, but his voice sounded hollow in the silence. He took a deep breath and started riding again, slower this time, scanning his surroundings. The forest seemed to shift around him, each tree identical to the last, each turn leading him back to where he started. The daylight had faded, leaving him in near total darkness. And then he heard it. A soft, rhythmic, crunching sound, like footsteps, echoing just behind him. He turned, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but saw nothing. He quickened his pace, the footsteps matching him stride for stride, always just out of sight. Then a whisper broke the silence, soft and chilling, as if spoken directly into his ear. "You shouldn't have come here." He froze, his breath fogging in the cold air. The voice was close, so close he could feel the chill on his neck. He spun around, but there was nothing but shadows and empty trail. Panicked, he began pedaling faster, pushing his legs to the limit, his breathing ragged and shallow. The forest blurred around him, the branches closing in, twisting like fingers trying to grab him. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, voices of different pitches and tones, all repeating the same phrase, "You shouldn't have come here. You don't belong here." Then, up ahead, he saw a flicker of light. A cabin nestled in the woods, its windows glowing with a soft, flickering light. Relief washed over him. Maybe someone was inside. Maybe he could get help. He sprinted toward it, his tires skidding over the rough trail. But as he drew closer, his relief turned to dread. The cabin was dilapidated, the wood rotten and sagging, covered in ivy and moss. The door was hanging ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Against every instinct, he approached, peering inside. The interior was dimly lit by a single flickering candle on an old table, surrounded by dust and cobwebs, and on the wall opposite him, scrawled in thick black letters, were the words, "You were warned." Shh! A chill ran down his spine as he backed away. Just then he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, drawing closer. He turned to see the figure from before, standing at the edge of the clearing, staring at him with hollow eyes. Panicking, Isaac scrambled onto his bike and rode as fast as he could, pedaling blindly through the forest. The figure's empty gaze burned into his mind. He didn't stop, didn't look back, pushing himself beyond exhaustion. Finally, he burst out of the forest, skidding onto the road where he had parked his car. The forest loomed behind him, silent and dark, as if it had swallowed the vanishing road completely. He collapsed onto his car, gasping for breath, his heart racing. As he steadied himself, he glanced back, half expecting to see the figure still watching him. But the trail entrance was gone. He never returned to Blackwood Forest after that. And though he tried to forget what he had seen, he was haunted by it. Every night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, he would hear it again, that soft, chilling whisper. "You shouldn't have come here."